The trip through heaven on earth. Hayes, Sid, and Cole's shroom trip through the cherry blossoms in D.C., March 23rd, 2024. Chapter 1, The Backstory. This is a long story, one that spans 11 hours long and is filled with core memories and moments. It begins in the Mary Graydon Center, 3 p.m. Me and Cole sit at a table, eating and discussing the trip with great anticipation for what we're about to experience. Unbeknownst to us, this experience would be so much more than what we were expecting. After finishing our food, we use the bathroom and meet up with Sid at the Kogod School of Business bus stop and take the bus to Tenleytown to purchase the shrooms and some weed. The shrooms we purchased were Penis Envy, a potent and powerful mushroom that enhances your visual senses and body experience. I purchased 3.1 grams, Cole with 4.1, and Sid at 2.2. Before consuming the shrooms, we had to stop off at Chick-fil-A where I purchased fries and sauce, all with the purpose of making the consumption much easier. As previously stated, we needed to purchase weed at Smoke Island, which is where we started walking. The trip was around 10 minutes, and along the way we pulled into an alley to consume the mushrooms. Once I finished consuming the mushrooms, I started a timer at 4 p.m., beginning the journey. Chapter 2, The Beginning. What happens next can be summed up in a few sentences. We purchased the weed, walked back to the Tenleytown train station next to Chick-fil-A, and almost immediately got on the train. In less than 10 minutes of being on the train, we feel the effects start to kick in, an unusual feeling as mushrooms take over an hour before anything begins. The dotted floor begins to move in twisted ways, almost appearing bloated. None of us were prepared for what we were about to experience. Chapter 3, The Approach. Farragut West was our stop. Once reaching it, I stood up and almost immediately felt the light impacts of the shrooms. My body felt like it was floating, and getting off the train, I made a drunken stumble. Cole felt happy, outgoing, and in a dancing mood. Sid had not felt anything yet. We reached the exit of the station, a 7-capacity elevator, and were forced to wait in a long line. Since the shrooms were in our system, the experience began harshly. I spoke much louder than I should have been, and me and Cole got trapped in a conversation about warm weather, beaches, and eventually Hawaii upon reaching the insides of the elevator. Since the train station was warm, we got wrapped up in the warm mindset. Once reaching the top, we immediately began realizing how goofy we were being. The outside was gray, windy, but also vibrant. Since we had only ever experienced DC at night, it was fun to see the city so lively. Me and Sid started exchanging comments on how DC reminds us of London, something we continued to talk about as we made our way closer to Lake Tidal Basin. A few minutes later, we made a stop at the Lafayette Square and the White House. We eventually ventured down to see the cherry blossoms. This walk built anticipation as we made our way down 17th Street, Northwest. The street was packed with life, vendors, and colors. Eventually, we made our way down to the Washington Monument. It felt so alive, packed, and beautiful, once again, with a couple of cherry blossoms in the middle of the field drawing lots of attention. We ourselves were drawn to the trees where we talked, took photos, and Sid tried to subtly post up. After a little layover, we made our way across the rest of the field and prepared to enter heaven on earth. As we approached the gates of heaven, we noticed more and more crowds of people swarming around us. It was now 5 p.m. We eventually reached the road, crossing the street, and truly beginning our great journey to heaven. Chapter 4, The Dismay. The journey didn't exactly start as perfect as we wanted it to be. Sid felt good, but me and Cole had the shroom feeling in the background. We mostly felt sober and extremely tired, like super drained. The entrance area for the cherry blossoms was filled with many food trucks and vendors. A perfect area to find some caffeine. Almost immediately, me and Cole embarked on our mission to find some caffeine. After 5 minutes of looking, we gave up and accepted our fate. We all sat down by a food stand defeated until Cole looked up, realizing a food truck behind us sold Red Bulls. Me and Cole sprinted towards the truck to get our boost of energy. Sadly, the Red Bull's $8, destroying me and Cole's pockets. What's even worse was that Cole bought the Red Bull first and didn't tell me the price, forcing me into getting scammed. If I go down, you go down with me. Drinking a Red Bull gave us both a nice boost of energy, and we felt more prepared to fully embark on the journey. By this point, it was almost 5:30, and while we were no longer tired, the shrooms weren't fully kicking in at their max, especially since we had taken higher doses than usual. The decision was made. It was time to break into the first of our 4 joints. First, we had to find a place, so we started to walk away from the cherry blossoms and towards the underneath of a small highway. Eventually, we ended up finding our spot after contemplating other areas. It was a tiny little tree by a baseball field. We would soon find out that this tree was in fact the tree of life and birth. Sitting and becoming comfortable on the extended roots of the tree gave us a feeling of relaxation. I pulled out the first joint, Red Bull in one hand, and started talking. After about 5 minutes of getting it carried away, the joint was lit, and we started smoking it, passing it around after 2 hits each. Almost immediately, our minds were expanded, and the tree of life started moving, its branches enclosing in on us, comforting our minds and bodies. The ground beneath us softened, with the light, luscious patches of grass beneath us becoming bouncy. Colors started exploding around us after each hit of the joint, and we eventually completely cleared the first joint, now fully embarked on our shroom journey. Everything was potent, life felt beautiful. I was the most tripped out I've ever been. The sun was slowly starting to prepare to set in a few hours, creating this heavenly aura around us. We knew it was time to return to the mystic lands and claim them as our new home. The walk back was exciting, almost like the anticipation we first felt when the shrooms kicked in about an hour ago. It was time for the next chapter to begin. Chapter 5, The Journey. This was the most potent part of the journey. Everything around me felt right, beautiful, and heavenly. We made our way to the Thomas Jefferson Memorial, a neoclassical building similar to the Pantheon in Rome. As we made our way to the front of the building by the stairs, we looked into the horizon. The sun was to set soon, in about an hour. We continued to trip as we walked through the iconic columns, entering the building and finding a random seat. This was potentially the most tripped out part of the journey. I looked up at the amazing architecture of the structure. Everything was moving in a beautiful way, and I was able to experience the memorial in such a unique perspective. I was fully entranced by the structure and almost felt religious at that moment. In the background, I heard whispers and echoes reverberating through the structure, adding to the tripped out experience. Eventually, we decided it was time to continue the journey, and this is where we discovered heaven. Chapter 6, The Gates of Heaven, Heaven on Earth. The sparkling water reflecting the pink glimmer of the onset of the sunset with the Washington Memorial and cherry blossoms in the background set the scene. We were all fully entranced, unable to look away from the gorgeous view. I almost walked into the water because I was so entrapped by what was consuming us. I had never seen something so beautiful in my entire life. The view was so beautiful, and being on shrooms made it 10 times better. We continued our walk for about 10 minutes, and along the way I heard weird, ghostly whispers, followed up by the awkward, crouched running of a group of fat kids going up the path we were following. I immediately started uncontrollably laughing, drawing attention to myself. It was a very funny scene. Due to this, however, we decided to take a seat across the street at the George Mason Memorial. This memorial is a beautiful garden with yellow flowers and pink trees in the background, obviously being extremely pleasing for a shroomed-up vision. We talked for a little and eventually decided to continue our journey. This time, we were to make our way into the white mystical woods of heaven. Upon entering the white woods of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial, we were immediately hit with a surreal feeling. What surrounded us felt like the elf woods from the Lord of the Rings. After a few more minutes of walking, we reached the gates of the memorial. A gust of wind moved the flowers and leaves towards the entrance, dragging us in with them. A dramatic scene, to say the least. Everything was so wonderful and gorgeous until a brief pause in our journey. The dreaded bathroom. Chapter 7. The Hell in Heaven. Here's the thing. When I first opened the Red Bull, I didn't immediately consume it like Cole did. I was holding it the entire time. It wasn't until 30 minutes later that I finally finished what was left, and my hands were so sticky. In addition, I'd used the bathroom more than anything else. The entire trip was hard for me to hold it together in such a crowded area. It would only get worse in the bathroom. Me and Cole went in together. This was the worst part. There was a large pack of annoying, loud, and obnoxious high schoolers on a field trip using the bathroom. Upon entering, I could barely act normal, and it got weird. By the time it was my turn for the urinal, I didn't know what to do. I walked up to the toilet, but then got nervous and instead just washed my hands, getting my coat wet in the process. I came back out in shock, making my way towards Sid, and feeling like other people were laughing at the fact that I was geeked. Me and Sid waited together until Cole arrived. I was afraid to go back into the bathroom, and was eventually forced to go back into the depths of hell and heaven. This time the bathroom was empty, excluding one person, and it was much easier to use, however, still strangely complicated. Once I was done, we made our way out and continued our walk through heaven. The white trees were pulsating, and it seemed to be one of the only things we saw. Everything was so white, clean, and perfect. Surrounding us were the walls of the memorials, engraved with weird hieroglyphics, only adding to the visual appeal. The walls felt alive. We kept walking for 5 minutes until we decided to take a seat on a bench overlooking a beautiful waterfall. At this moment, we sat in silence, listening to music, until we decided to talk for a few more minutes. Ultimately, we got tired of just sitting around and decided to keep walking, making our way to the MLK Memorial. Chapter 8. The Heavenly White Petals. Just like the FDR Memorial, the MLK Memorial emitted a heavenly ambiance. The shrooms were still extremely potent, however, we felt like in an hour or two they would start to come down. We decided to smoke and made our way to a field in order to light. The bushes by this field had a meaning to me, as they were the place I once called home on my last room trip in this area. The only difference was that the trip at night was colder and more gloomy, with the trees also being partially dead since it was the winter. In addition, the bushes were just outside of the fence that led to this build. Once we reached the field, it completely opened up to us, the sun setting in the background. It was time to relax and embrace our journey. Chapter 9. The Endless Field of Beauty. The field was vast. White petals laid on the floor and the grass was fluffy. The clouds were so clear and we saw each individual white fluff move. It looked as if the clouds were congregating in one center area, with the darkness of the night consuming the clouds once they reached that center. Right before settling, we took a few group photos for the core memories. Cole then made himself feel at home by lying a towel on the floor and taking out his speaker. Me and Sid continued to stare off into the distance, watching the sunset, letting the visual aspects of the shrooms play themselves out. It was gorgeous. I took out the second joint and passed it to Cole, who immediately started the cycle, passing it to me once he was done. Taking the joint in hand, I made multiple deep, slow pulls, fully embracing the weed and heightening the effects of the shrooms with each hit I took. I then passed the joint, looking off into the distance, and it was breathtaking. So breathtaking, I let out a few tears at the complete beauty and surreal moment. I stared for a while. Minutes passed in what felt like seconds. My eyes made their way to the floor as I looked at the grass mixed with the petals. I started seeing even more visuals staring at the floor. This continued for at least 15 to 20 minutes, and the sky darkened around me with time fading. Before we knew it, everything was dark, and while we were still high off mushrooms, the come-down was nearby. The visual effects weren't as potent, but we were all still having a great time. Cole played Cigarette's Daydream, piecing the shroom chip together with the previous ones. He then continued to go back into his meditative state, something he had been practicing on the floor the entire time me and Sid were standing, staring off into the distance. After a while, me and Sid were talking about how beautiful the lands of heaven and earth were, but eventually decided to watch a movie and continue the story we were creating. Since we were on drugs, we got off track with the conversations about what we experienced all day. It wasn't until around 30 minutes of me and Sid convincing each other to watch a movie that we decided it was time. The only issue was that Cole refused to buy a ticket, so me and Sid were forced to pay for his. Suddenly, Cole stood up and exclaimed that the reason why he was on the floor was because, and I quote, "the cold has trapped his body to the floor and he couldn't get up." Then he followed up that sentence by immediately starting a random sprint through the dark. When he returned, Cole stated that he had a splendid time running through the fields, so I decided to do the same. I dropped my backpack and sprinted through the field, following what Cole had done. I felt so freed, and looking at the moving ground while tripping was so freeing and fun. When I returned, I inspired Sid to do the same. Unfortunately, he felt more sobered up, so he pulled up the third joint and smoked 3/4 of it. This helped us continue the journey and suppress the shroom cars that was creeping up behind us. We finally had our mission: make our way to the movie theater and randomly pick out a movie once we arrived. Before we did this, we first stopped off at the MLK Memorial we were at earlier. This time, it was night. We only spent 5 minutes there, but it was a cool experience, especially because the memorial was not yet empty. However, it was more empty compared to before. Once taking it all in, we were completely ready to make our way into downtown DC. Chapter 10, the dreaded walk. The walk to the theater was long. My feet were killing me as my shoes were extremely uncomfortable. As we made our way out the heaven of earth, the lit-up Washington Memorial immediately caught our attention. We made our way closer to it, eventually getting underneath the memorial. At first, we planned on sitting for a few minutes at the bottom of the memorial to look up, but decided we couldn't kill any more time. It was now 9, and we had a movie to see. Now, making our way further out put us towards Constitution Ave, aka Museum Row. We stopped off at the African American History Museum to just look at the architecture and talk about potentially seeing the museum in the future. Once we finished the conversation, we kept walking deeper into DC and towards the theater. What me and Sid didn't know was that Cole's shroom trip had transcended him into an indie, punk, rebel, softcore boy. As we got closer to the theater, Cole had picked. We decided to kill the rest of the third joint as our high was starting to come down. We made our way down the street, smoking the joint discreetly. However, Cole wanted to be a punk and smoke in front of other people. Finally, we reached the theater. A landmark. Something me and Sid had never heard of. It was one of Cole's little indie theaters, and me and Sid were not having it. The theater was so tiny and run down. Cole left to go inside and use the bathroom, leaving me and Sid holding a joint out in front of the theater. Cole's intentions was to clearly make me and Sid swoop down to his rebel level. We weren't having it, and I hid the joint in my hand, thwarting Cole's plans for us. After a long 15 minutes of waiting outside, Cole made his way back to us, where me and Sid announced we weren't going to take his indie shit. We just decided to go to the Great Regal instead and watch Ghostbusters at 11. At this point, it was a little past 10, and if we were to watch anything at the landmark, we would have been late to the movie. We continued moving for about 10 more minutes, taking a break at a random block, smoking some of the last joint, and moving into the packed Chinatown, which was busy due to a Wizards game being let out. The theater was attached to Capital One Arena, the home of the Wizards, and we still had the rest of the last joint to kill. We backtracked around the block and finished the rest of our weed. After finishing all the weed, we moved towards the theater. It was nearly 11. We entered the theater, I bought our tickets, and we went in together after Cole bought popcorn since he didn't purchase a ticket. Chapter 11, the final chapter, the film and return. The theater was nearly empty. DC closes early, and as a New Yorker, this is weird and a sombering feeling. We sat in the back behind a couple and prepared for the movie. A few minutes after the film started, a group of 7 or 8 others arrived, sitting next to the couple in front of us. They were certainly loud. The movie was one of the worst I've ever seen. Being high made it even worse as me and Cole critiqued the poor acting, plot, and overall goofiness of the film, along with the forced tropes and relationships. By the end of the movie, we were dead, unable to move as we stayed still to the end of the credits, actively trying to find an Uber. We were so exhausted after walking over 8.4 miles throughout the day in uncomfortable shoes. Finding an Uber was impossible, and we'd stayed so late the theater employees had to kick us out. Eventually, after using the bathroom, Cole found a lift after previous drivers canceled on him. It was time to return home. We got back into the car after waiting 5 minutes and set course for home. On the drive back, I listened to Camp by Childish Gambino, reminiscing about the incredible day we had just had. Once we returned back to campus, I immediately washed up and went to bed, exhausted by the core memory of a day we had just created. Together, we experienced heaven on earth, sparked by the tree of life. And in a way, I feel like the trip brought us all mentally closer and together as one, without it being the intention of the trip. That was the trip through heaven on earth.